Russell crossed the line on pole in Barcelona, and within minutes, the question nobody at Mercedes wanted to hear was back. Was that lap legal? Because this was not just George Russell beating Lewis Hamilton by a tiny margin. This was Mercedes winning another qualifying fight in a season where rivals have already questioned its engine, its electrical power, its shutdown tricks, and even the way the car passes through the rulebook. And here is the dangerous part. There is no confirmed proof that Russell's Barcelona pole was illegal. But Formula One does not panic over nothing. When a team gets investigated once, people watch. When it happens again, people whisper. But when the same team keeps finding speed exactly where the rules are hardest to understand, the entire paddock starts asking one terrifying question. Is Mercedes simply smarter than everyone else, or has the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile not found the hidden detail yet? Because if Russell's pole is clean, Mercedes may have just exposed the biggest advantage of the new era. But if one line in the rulebook was crossed, Barcelona could become the qualifying lap that changes the championship. Subscribe to the channel. The first thing people need to understand is this. Barcelona did not create the suspicion around Mercedes. Barcelona exposed it. George Russell's pole only became explosive because the question around Mercedes had already been building for months. This was not one angry rival team reacting to one fast lap. This was the result of an entire season where the silver arrows kept appearing at the center of the same uncomfortable conversation. How are they finding that speed? That question matters because Formula One changed in a way that made hidden performance more valuable than ever. The cars are not just fighting with engines and wings anymore. They are fighting with energy, with software, with battery deployment, with tiny decisions happening inside the car that no fan can see from the grandstand. And that is where the suspicion begins. Because when a driver is fast through a corner, everyone can understand that. Maybe he trusted the car more. Maybe he braked later. Maybe he carried more speed. But when a car seems to accelerate harder at exactly the right moment, when it seems to keep its power alive longer than expected, when it finds hundredths of a second in places rivals cannot explain, the mood changes. Suddenly, the lap is not just impressive. It becomes suspicious. Mercedes entered this new era with a car that looked dangerous from the beginning. The W17 was fast in qualifying, especially in Russell's hands. He was not just surviving the pressure. He was putting the car in positions that forced every rival engineer to go back to the data and ask whether they had missed something. And in Formula One, that is how a technical storm usually begins. Not with a dramatic announcement. Not with a public accusation. It begins in quiet rooms, with engineers looking at speed traces, comparing acceleration zones, and realizing that another team's car is doing something their model did not predict. That is why Russell's Barcelona pole hit so hard. It fit a pattern. Before Barcelona, Mercedes had already faced questions about its power unit. Rivals had raised concerns about how the engine behaved when it was hot on track, compared with how it looked during colder inspections. That detail sounds small, but it is not. Think of it like measuring a runner's shoes while they are sitting on a table, then watching those same shoes change shape once the race begins. If everything stays within the rules, fine. But if the performance changes under real conditions, the entire paddock wants answers. Mercedes was initially cleared, but the fact that deeper checks were being discussed already changed the atmosphere. It told every rival team that the governing body was watching the silver arrows closely. And once that happens, every big Mercedes lap carries extra weight. Then came the electrical controversy, the part of this story that makes Barcelona so dangerous. The new rules made electrical power a huge part of performance. That power is not just a bonus. It can decide a lap. It can decide pole. It can decide whether a driver starts in clean air or trapped behind another car. For a casual fan, the easiest way to understand it is this. Imagine two runners reaching the final stretch. One has to slowly reduce speed before the finish line. The other finds a way to keep pushing harder for just a little longer. The gap may look tiny, but in qualifying, tiny is everything. Mercedes and Red Bull had found a way to use an emergency shutdown function in a way that raised major concerns. The function was meant to protect the power unit when something went wrong. It was not designed as a performance weapon. But when teams discovered that it could help avoid the normal power reduction at the end of a qualifying lap, the rest of the paddock reacted immediately. Because that is exactly the kind of detail that can turn a good lap into pole position. Not by seconds. By hundredths. And in Barcelona, Russell beat Hamilton by the kind of margin that makes hundredths feel enormous. That is why rivals did not look at the timing screen and simply shrug. They looked at Mercedes' history this season. They looked at the previous technical questions. They looked at the electrical loophole that had already been closed. They looked at a front row decided by almost nothing. And they asked the obvious question. Was this just George Russell at his best, or was Mercedes still holding an advantage nobody else fully understood? That is the dangerous space Mercedes now lives in. Because being clever is legal. Finding performance is legal. Reading the rulebook better than your rivals is part of Formula One. But there is a point where cleverness becomes so effective that everyone else starts treating it like a threat. Mercedes has reached that point. Every time the car delivers something spectacular, it does not just create admiration. It creates pressure. It creates suspicion. It creates a demand for explanation. And that is brutal for Russell. Because from his side, he did what a racing driver is supposed to do. He got in the car, trusted his hands, trusted the tires, and delivered when the pressure was highest. But the moment he crossed the line fastest, the focus started shifting away from the driver and toward the machine. That is the price of driving for a team under the microscope. A normal pole is celebrated. A Mercedes pole this season is investigated by the eyes of the paddock before anyone even says the word officially. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one lap. Barcelona was not just about whether Russell's pole was legal. It was about whether Mercedes can still be trusted to dominate qualifying without every rival assuming there must be something hidden underneath. That is the real problem. Because if the car is legal, then Mercedes may have found the cleanest, smartest advantage of the new era. But if the governing body finds even one detail that crosses the line, then Russell's Barcelona pole becomes something far more dangerous. Not just a great lap. A turning point. But the real danger for Mercedes was not the Barcelona lap by itself. It was the memory of what had already happened. Because earlier in the season, the Silver Arrows had already been dragged into one of the most sensitive technical arguments in modern Formula One. Not about wings. Not about tire wear. Not about strategy. About electrical power. And that matters because the new era of Formula One has made electrical energy one of the most powerful weapons on the car. It is not just an extra boost. It is not some small background detail only engineers care about. It can change the shape of a qualifying lap. It can decide whether a car reaches the timing line with full force, or whether it begins to fade at the exact moment the lap needs to be strongest. That is why the controversy around the motor generator unit kinetic became so important. The name sounds technical, but the idea is simple. The car recovers energy, stores it, and then uses it to help drive the car forward. Think of it like a hidden burst of strength the driver can rely on when every fraction of a second matters. In qualifying, that burst is gold. But the rules did not allow teams to use that power however they wanted. As drivers approached the end of a flying lap, electrical output had to reduce in a controlled way. In plain English, the car was not supposed to keep pushing at maximum electrical force all the way to the timing line. And that is where Mercedes found itself in the middle of the storm. There was an emergency shutdown function inside the system. It existed for protection. If something went wrong, the system could shut down to prevent damage. It was a safety measure, not a racing trick. But Mercedes and Red Bull discovered a way that this emergency function could be used to avoid the normal power reduction. That is the part that made rival teams furious. Because if a car can hold stronger electrical power for longer at the end of a qualifying lap, even for a tiny distance, the gain may only be hundredths of a second. But in Formula One, hundredths are not tiny. Hundredths are pole position. Hundredths are track position. Hundredths are clean air into the first corner. Hundredths can decide whether a championship swings toward one driver or another. And in Barcelona, Russell's gap to Hamilton was exactly the kind of margin that makes every rival remember those hundredths. That is why the suspicion came back so quickly. Not because anyone had confirmed wrongdoing in Barcelona, but because the method that had already caused controversy was directly connected to the kind of advantage that can win qualifying. The governing body eventually stepped in and made the rule clearer. The emergency shutdown function could only be used for real technical problems. Not for performance. Not for a clever final burst. Not as a way to bend the meaning of the regulation without breaking the written words. And to make sure teams did not try it again, the punishment became harsh. If the system shut down during a lap, it would be locked out for a full minute. That meant any team trying to use it as a trick would likely destroy its own lap, or even damage its race situation. On paper, that should have closed the story. But Formula One does not forget that quickly. Once rivals believe a team has discovered a hidden advantage in one part of the rulebook, they start looking for the next one. That is exactly what happened to Mercedes. The electrical shutdown controversy became more than a single technical issue. It became a symbol. A symbol that Mercedes was searching places other teams had not mastered yet. A symbol that the Silver Arrows might understand the new regulations better than the rest of the grid. And when that belief takes hold, every future lap is judged differently. Russell could drive the same corner perfectly. Hamilton could miss pole by almost nothing. Antonelli could sit third. And still, the first reaction from rivals would not only be admiration. It would be suspicion. Because Formula One teams do not fear normal speed. Normal speed can be copied. Normal speed can be chased. Normal speed gives engineers a target. What they fear is hidden speed. The kind that comes from software logic, power behavior, or rule interpretation. The kind that does not show itself clearly in photographs. The kind that forces everyone else to ask the governing body for help, because the advantage is buried too deeply inside the machine. That is the uncomfortable place Barcelona sits in. Russell's pole may have been completely clean. The source material does not confirm any specific illegality from his lap. But the suspicion around it is not random. It comes from a season where Mercedes has already been questioned in exactly the areas that decide qualifying performance. And this is why the story gets bigger than Russell. Because the driver becomes the face of something he does not fully control. He is the one in the cockpit. He is the one delivering the lap. He is the one taking the risk. But the controversy follows the car beneath him, not just the hands on the steering wheel. That creates a brutal emotional split. For Russell, Barcelona should feel like proof. Proof that he can beat Hamilton. Proof that he can fight Antonelli. Proof that he can still be the driver Mercedes needs in a tense championship battle. But for the paddock, Barcelona becomes another data point. Another Mercedes qualifying peak. Another lap that needs explaining. Another reason to wonder whether the Silver Arrows have found something that will only become obvious when the governing body looks closer. And that is where the pressure shifts to Toto Wolff. Because Wolff has to defend two things at once. He has to defend Russell's achievement, and he has to defend Mercedes' technical reputation. Those are not the same battle. Defending Russell means saying the driver earned the lap. That he was brave, precise, and fast when it mattered. Defending Mercedes means saying the car earned its speed within the rules. That the advantage came from legal engineering, not a hidden shortcut. If Wolff only talks about Russell, critics will say he is avoiding the technical question. If he only talks about legality, it can make the pole sound like a courtroom case instead of a sporting achievement. That is the trap. And Mercedes has been walking into that trap all season. At Suzuka, the front wing came under scrutiny. The car was checked, questions were asked, and Mercedes was cleared. No illegal attempt to bypass the regulations was found. That should have helped the team. But in the emotional world of Formula One, even being cleared can still leave a mark. Because the headline people remember is not always, Mercedes legal. Sometimes the headline they remember is, Mercedes investigated. That difference matters. A cleared investigation can still feed suspicion, because it reminds everyone that the car was suspicious enough to be checked in the first place. Then came the earlier concerns around the power unit itself, with rivals questioning how the Mercedes engine behaved when hot and running at full intensity. Again, this was not a confirmed Barcelona violation. But it added another layer to the same story. Engine behavior. Electrical deployment. Emergency shutdowns. Front wing flexibility. Qualifying dominance. One by one, these details created a picture. And whether that picture is fair or not, Barcelona made it impossible to ignore. Russell's pole was not just a lap at the front of the grid. It was the latest chapter in a season where Mercedes keeps surviving the technical spotlight, while rivals keep pushing the light closer. That is why the word illegal is so powerful here. Not because it has been proven. Because it is the fear sitting underneath the entire Mercedes season. The fear that the advantage is not just clever. The fear that the gap between legal genius and illegal performance might be thinner than anyone wants to admit. And in Formula One, that line is everything. Cross it, and a victory can become a scandal. Stay just inside it, and you are called brilliant. Mercedes has built its season on living near that line. That is why Barcelona feels so tense. Because if the governing body looks at Russell's lap and finds nothing, Mercedes gains more than pole position. It gains another argument that its speed is legitimate, that rivals are frustrated, and that the Silver Arrows are simply better at reading the new era. But if even one small detail raises concern, the entire meaning of the lap changes. Hamilton's second place becomes part of the evidence. Antonelli's third becomes part of the pressure. Russell's tiny margin becomes the number everyone repeats. And Mercedes' whole season of technical questions suddenly looks less like coincidence, and more like a trail. That is the danger now. The pole itself may stand. The car may pass every check. Russell may have done nothing more than deliver a world-class lap at the perfect moment. But the suspicion has already done its work. It has turned a great qualifying result into a question the team cannot escape. And the next part of the story is even more serious, because the governing body is not the only threat Mercedes has to worry about. The rivals are watching too. And rivals do not need proof to start applying pressure.